Okay, welcome. This is the meeting of the Finance and Audit Committee. Members of the committee are hereby advised of their duty under the State Government Ethics Act to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflict, and are instructed to refrain from participating in any matter coming before this committee with respect to which there is a conflict of interest or an appearance of conflict. Are there any conflicts to be noted at this time? Okay, if something arises in the meeting, you can just let us know. The first matter on the agenda is the consideration and approval of the minutes of our last meeting, which was August 28th, 2020. Do I have a motion?
Move they be accepted.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. So all in favor, just go ahead and use your buttons to vote, please. Not many voting folks on here, so I think the motion has passed. Okay. Our next item is the consideration of the financial statements for the third quarter of 2020. And this would be our statement of assets, liabilities, and fund balance, and also kind of our statement of revenues and expenditures. So anybody have any questions or comments on that? Alice, anything in particular that you want to bring to our attention?
Just a couple of things, Barbara. I think my opening note sort of says it all, which is, there are a lot of people who are suffering financially because of COVID-19, but it has not adversely impacted our financial situation. If anything, we are in a better financial situation for the year because our expenses are so depressed, primarily because we're not traveling and we're not having in-person meetings and we're not having a lot of expenses we would normally have. And our revenues have remained pretty much the same. I think we have slightly more lawyers who have not paid at this juncture of the year than we would usually have, but we have collected 98% of what we budgeted. We also have had a big year in terms of new membership. We've been sort of stagnant for a number of years, and this year they had a high pass rate on the exam. I think some people may have come to North Carolina because we were giving the exam. Then we have the uniform bar exam, and we're still trying to see, how many people are just going ahead and taking the uniform bar exam here in North Carolina. But anyways, we've seen an increase in our membership. And so we're seeing, I think, some of that consequence with the dues collection. A couple of weird items that I just wanted to point out. Well, first of all, on the penalty income, even though we delayed the penalty income, thinking we give people additional time to pay and that would be helpful to folks in a financial difficulty, we still have 1,900 lawyers who are delinquent and will owe the $30 late fee. So we'll actually, if they all pay, it will be in excess of what we budgeted. Now, I don't know what's going to happen with the administrative committee. I don't know if they're going to be more sympathetic to late payers or not. And maybe Peter can tell us what he sensed from the administrative committee's meeting.
The committee, has made some their intention to be a little bit more forgiving in some areas, but the delay of the application of the late fee was really the extent to which the administrative committee is going to deal with that issue. I think that they will still require and accept payment of those late fees.
And just make the exceptions for people where it's a health issue or something that has really unique circumstances. Okay, so we may see additional revenue in the penalty income line item. One of the stranger things on the budget that I want to point out to you is an artwork donation. The Board of Physical Therapy wanted to honor John Silverstein because he was their long-term legal counsel. And they sought donations of money to purchase a piece of art for him. This was what he expressed to them he would like, and to make it a part of the State Bar collection. But they felt like they didn't have the mechanism to hold on to those funds. So they asked us to hold those funds. We did. They collected roughly $4,000. And that money was used to purchase a piece of art that Leslie Silverstein helped to pick out, along with our art consultant for the State Bar. So it's something that clearly fits in with our art collection. You don't see it as an expense item because it was capitalized. So it shows up in our capital acquisitions. But we will do some kind of dedication ceremony for the artwork in 2021. I suspect we won't wait until we can do it without social distancing, and I will notify the officers of that, and we'll just have a very small ceremony here at the State Bar building. I don't have comments on anything else other than the bank service charges as an expense item. We are seeing our bank service charges be higher than what we had budgeted. And there's a couple reasons for that. There are a lot of people did not pay the 2020 dues in late 2019 as they usually do. So those expenses rolled over into 2020. And then online payments this year have increased by 30%. So we're seeing increased bank fees for the use of credit card payments. Jaya is looking into its ACH payments, I believe, as a way of trying to reduce those charges that we have for folks paying by credit cards. And we'll try to get that in place as soon as we can to get those prices or those costs down. And then one other thing, and this is really on an expense item. At the beginning of this year, I went to Lawyers Mutual and suggested that to them, instead of them giving us $2,500 each quarter to offset the expenses for receptions at our quarterly meeting, that they just go ahead and give us $12,000 at the beginning of the year. So we would have it and we would use it judiciously and we would give them credit for it. And they were very happy to do that. I guess because they didn't have to write as many checks. Well, we haven't had meetings since January. And I reached out to them through Julie Beavers, and I'm sure she talked with, is it John? I'm trying to think of the chairman. Gray will tell me. And said, what would you like to do with these funds? Would you like us to roll them over into 2021 when we hope to be having in-person meetings? What would you like to do? And they asked us to do that. So $9,000 of those funds will roll over into 2021. The effect on our budget is that the expenses for the council meetings increased by $9,000, and that shows up in this set of financial statements. But overall, the consequence of the financial effect of the pandemic is that, and you can see it when you look at our net surplus for the year, what we budgeted. We had $312,000 as being our net surplus, and this is all before the mortgage payments. Keep that in mind. But we had a net surplus of in excess of $312,000. At this juncture, we anticipate a surplus of $3.5 million. So clearly, this year financially helped us to put at bay that point at which we are consistently deficit spending and using our reserve funds, which we've been talking about for a long time and is the reason we were going to the General Assembly seeking an increase in the dues. So that sort of tees it up for the next item on the agenda. And I'd be glad to answer any questions anybody has about any of the financial statements.
Does anybody have any questions for Alice or Jaya Colin?
Alice, one of the things I was looking at was that we've gone to the accrual system out of the cash system, I guess last year, and our pension fund shows up as a zero expense. I just wondered why we weren't accruing that quarterly or something to be a more accurate reflection of what our liabilities were. And that may be, it may not matter, but it just seemed like to me that rather than if we're accruing things all year, that would be an expense that might show us, you know, a truer picture of where we are at the end of the third quarter.
Mm-hmm. I see what you're saying, Colin, and I always find that kind of disconcerting too. When you see it as zero in there, and then it's like, well, no, actually, we have a substantial amount. I'll let Jaya answer that. I suspect this may be something that the auditors recommended, that we handle it that way.
Right. So that's what the recommendation from the auditors was that we will true it up in December. So even though the surplus shows as 3.5 million at September end, that's not nowhere close where the surplus will be at the end of the year. We have 3 more months to go with expenses.
My question is not about the surplus, but about the pension under the personnel expenses. It shows that we budgeted $476,000, but we have zero actual. And I was under the opinion that if we've paid people the payroll, we have the obligation to make the pension contribution, and that we would have accumulated 9 months of obligation where we are right now as opposed to zero.
Okay, I mean, so I can do a quarterly accrual of the pension. It will just be a very rough estimate because the numbers that I get from payroll is at the end of the year, but I can do an estimate if that helps everybody. That's not a problem.
I think it would be helpful, and you can indicate that it's an estimate. It's just, I think he's right. When we look at this, you know, we tend to focus on what's in front of us and to forget what's not showing.
Yes, I don't think the auditors will have any problems with us doing
Okay. All right, just asking if it isn't that. I thought it might be helpful. If it's not, that's fine.
It would be helpful, Colin. I think you're exactly correct.
I usually put a note in there that says don't count on this being zero, but I think that makes a lot of sense if that's not an issue for the auditors.
Well, you did put it in your notes, but it's still better when it's just right there with the numbers for us.
So would you want that to be adjusted in September, or do you want me to just do it going forward?
Going forward's fine. I mean, I just thought it might be, you know.
I think going forward.
Yeah, it'll show up next quarter as a year-end expense at the end of the next quarter, and then so it'd be the first quarter of the new year before it would be relevant, I think, and that's plenty of time to do it.
Okay.
But we would like her to do it not just one time, but going forward each quarter. Is that the desire of the committee?
Yeah, that's my fault.
Sure. Okay, do we have a motion for approval of the financial statements for the third quarter?
So moved. Second.
All right. Is there any other discussion or questions?
I just think Alice should know his name is Dan Zurich, and she's never going to see another dime from Lawyers Mutual. And Alice, on the next test, that we'll be asking you who the chairman of the board is.
No, Gray, don't tell him.
Don't tell on me, Gray.
Yeah, don't tell him.
All I could do is see his last name starting with a Z.
Yeah.
That's how my brain works.
You have to learn to just kind of put your head down. Okay. All in favor of approval of financial statements, please indicate by voting. All right. Thank you so much. Okay, our next item is to set the membership dues for 2021. And we're currently at $300, and that is the statutory maximum. And I guess before we discuss that, we'll ask Peter to give us if there is any update on our bill.
Well, there's no real update that will that's anything more than conjecture. I mean, so we won't have anything obviously for 2021, but the hope is that, you know, the beginning of another session here in January we'll try again. But there's certainly they're going to be facing, the legislature this coming year will be facing a lot of shortfalls. And so it's going to be a harder road to plow if they are looking at making cuts everywhere and someone's coming and asking for an increase. So I wouldn't, I'm hopeful and optimistic that we can do something, but I wouldn't rely or depend upon needing it, getting the increase for 2022.
Sort of feels like we missed our window a bit through no fault of our own for a while. Okay, in light of that, is there a motion to be made about the amount of dues for 2021?
I move we set it at $300.
Second.
That motion's been made and seconded. Is there any other discussion? Okay, all in favor, please go ahead and vote. All right, thank you. That motion passes. And then the next thing we need to do is to set the assessment that we charge for the client, support of the client security fund. And there are materials that were provided to you about that. And the recommendation of the Client Security Fund Board is that that be continued at $25. Been that for a while, I think. So I will entertain a motion.
I move we set it at $25.
Second.
Thank you, Darren. Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion, questions, comment? Okay. Then please go ahead and vote on that motion. That motion passes. Thank you. Okay. Peter, do you want to give us an update on the software project that we've discussed in the last couple of meetings?
Yes, I was hoping to be able to tell you today that we've fully executed the contract, but it hasn't happened yet. I'm still think it will happen this week. We've completed the negotiations with the company and have settled on a contract that an agreement that both sides are supportive of. It's really, we're just waiting for the company, which is called ThoughtSpan Technology. We're waiting on them to add the insurance certificates as required by our agreement that they obtained for us, and then we will execute the document. So we're very excited. The plan is to begin the project in November with the goal of completion of the project in mid-2021. So everything we've talked about and got approval for is moving along quite nicely. And so we're excited to kickstart the project and begin the development and get this thing rolled out.
Good, great. Exciting. Anybody have any questions for Peter?
I would just point out that in terms of finance and audit, the first payment in this contract looks like it, as it looks in the agreement, would come in January.
Okay, all right, thank you. I don't think there's anything for us to need to approve. That was just sort of an update and report, and everything sounds like what we've looked at already. And
That's correct.
We'll see it reflected in our next budget.
That's correct.
That's right.
Okay. The next item came up as there was a discussion, it may have been Darren that brought it up, but somebody did, to say that they knew that some states have an assessment and support of their lawyers assistance program. So I know some research has been done and some information gathered, and I'm not sure who's going to report to us on that, but whoever it is, I'd appreciate going ahead and doing it.
All right, Barbara, that would be me.
Uh-huh.
And Jaya and I worked together on this. I would note, so Virginia is one of the states that does this. Their Supreme Court approved a lawyer wellness fee fund of $30. And they did that in 2019. And then there are a few other states that are doing it as well. This is an option to, again, hold off the day of reckoning where we are dipping too severely into our reserve funds. And I think it has the potential to hold off that day of reckoning for possibly a substantial period of time. I asked Jaya to do our projections where we're making assumptions about what our revenues would be based on, what we believe the number of members we will have, and our revenue streams from other sources, and then to make assumptions about what our expenses would be. It doesn't presume any kind of new expenses. It assumes we'll have continuing to have our standard expenses, and that they'll have annual increases. And she has included all of the assumptions on, I think it's the 4th sheet in these materials. So you can look at all of those fairly conservative assumptions that we've made about increases in revenues and increases in expenses. All of this is intended to show you what is on the chart that is on page 23. And basically, so what you see on the financial statements, it says scenario 1, dues $300, lap fee 0. So this is our current situation, is what you're seeing on these expenses and revenue streams. And then what we did was using those same numbers and just projecting that the Supreme Court would agree to do an assessment for funds to pay for the LAP program. We ran 2 scenarios. Keep in mind that you can play with these scenarios. So the scenario 2 is we keep the dues the same, $300, and we add this assessment of $30 a year starting in 2022. And I said 2022 because realistically, we would need to do a lot of groundwork to get the court to this point. And it really couldn't realistically go into effect until 2022, assuming the court is in agreement to do this. But the first scenario is we keep the dues consistent and we do a lap fee of $30. Based on our projections of expenses, that would bring in slightly more than what we would need to run the LAP program for 2022, 2023, and I believe 2024. But then in 2025, it would bring in slightly less than would be needed for that year. So what we would do under this scenario is any excess over the actual expenses to run the LAP program would be put in a special reserve exclusively for the LAP program to be used at that point where the expenses exceed what we get from the assessment. And we would just roll that forward to the point where we might need to go back to the court and say the assessment needs to be increased. And an assessment like this would be very much like the client security fund, where we would go to the court on an annual basis with a request that they approve the assessment in a certain amount. Scenario 3 takes a little different approach. It says, okay, so lawyers are gonna have to pay more. Why don't we drop the dues back and start the lap fees at $30 and see what happens if we do that? And what you can see on that scenario is that it isn't nearly as kind of beneficial in holding off our dipping into reserves. And I'm calling it reserves. It's called unrestricted cash on this chart. Scenario 2, where we keep the dues consistent and we have a LAP assessment coming in, it will not only keep us from dipping further into our reserves, it can actually help to replace some of those reserves over time. So the point of this is not to say do it one way or another. It's to simply show you that, in fact, this is potentially a way for us to avoid the problem that we're in, which is, we thought we were going to be able to have a dues increase possibly as early as 2021 if the bill had passed. That's not going to happen. It's very in question whether we might get the bill passed in 2022 or 2021 for 2022 or thereafter. This is one way to address that problem. There are several things to think about, one of which is timing. And I think this is just right now something simply for discussion by the Finance and Audit Committee. I think we absolutely have to wait until after the election to understand where the Supreme Court is. I wouldn't even suggest that we bring this up in our conversation with the Chief Justice that is scheduled for Wednesday. I think it's too early in that. We don't know what the Supreme Court's going to look like until after the election. And I think it's just something we need to kind of think about, and how we would couch it, and how, you know, what would be the initial proposal and all of that. Peter, when I ran this idea by Peter said that we would actually need to do some politicking of doing this, even though it would go through the Supreme Court, that there might be an issue with the General Assembly. So Peter, would you pick up on that?
Well, I think anytime you if we've been seeking a dues increase at the General Assembly and we haven't received that dues increase, and then we go and try to increase the revenue that we receive from the judiciary, it could look like we're doing an end around of the General Assembly, and depending on how that makes the General Assembly feel, you could see repercussions from that if you're not careful.
This would give us a flexibility, though. And while I agree that we have to be concerned about the picture we're painting with the General Assembly, I think that what we could do is maybe draw back our request for a dues increase for a couple of years if we could get something like this passed, and then later a dues increase request of the legislature. And then possibly at that point, the flexibility it gives us is that we can go up and down on this assessment as we see the need in conjunction with any dues increase. I mean, the flexibility is uncontroverted. I mean, and it would just be something that would be helpful for us financially, not just in the short run, but in the long run, way down.
Remind me of what our dollar contribution each year has been for LAP, roughly? Is it
800,000?
The cost of the LAP program?
Now, over the part that we've been contributing through the.
Well, CLE last year
The CLE,
contributed 323,000, right?
yeah,
And
so the CLE, and let me speak to that, how that would work. So the CLE board many years ago was just accumulating money, and it was really piling up because, and it's largely the penalty income that they collect for late forms and for late compliance and all that stuff. And there was a real sense that, you know, that's not what you're supposed to be doing with this money. It needs to go to something appropriate. And the CLE board was approached and basically said, look, the lawyer assistance program, which was still PALS at that time, the lawyer assistance program is essentially a competency program. Continuing legal education is a competency program. Would you agree to using your excess funds on an annual basis? And it had a formula for it, but it was, so they kept a certain amount in reserve, and then they used the remaining excess and paid that over to the state bar to be used to defray the costs of the CLE program, not the CLE program, the LAP program, excuse me, the LAP program. Last year was kind of a banner year, and CLE can be like that. It can be very weird. You can have one year where you got a lot of people who are out of compliance, and the next year where they're all in compliance. It'll be interesting to see where we are this year because everybody's at home and may be able to do more online, and we've changed it to online. Peter's giving me some sign, but or he's taking our picture.
Taking a picture, doing my duty.
But last year was an aberration in terms of what their penalty income was. $220,000 is really more like what is the average that we get. It will fluctuate. It has fluctuated year to year. If we do an assessment, if the Supreme Court approves an assessment, what I would recommend is that we go back to the CLE board and we say, thank you for doing that for all these years. You're going to have the same problem. You're going to have these excess funds. And our recommendation is that those be given to the state bar to offset the expenses of the ethics program, which is also a competency program. And I mean, it's a board of the council. And the request would essentially be coming from the officers and the council. So I wouldn't anticipate that they would say, no, we refuse to do that, in the same way they didn't, some 10 plus years ago with regard to using the funds for LAP. But that's how that money is recaptured. And that's partly why you see on this chart that scenario number 2 showing us our reserves bouncing back, is because those funds are recaptured and used to offset other expenses of the state bar.
But I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. The question I was asking was about what we were paying, but it looks like we're budgeting about 770,000.
And then about 220 comes from CLE. So
CLE, right, and the other $500,000 comes
Yes.
out of, or
Yes, sir.
550 comes out of us. Okay.
Right.
yeah. And as Darren pointed out, we'd have flexibility to, set that assessment at exactly what we think LAP budget would be, somewhere closer to that.
Yeah.
Or, yeah. So because this is an assessment, we don't have to go to the legislature. I mean, that's very basic, but I just want to make sure everybody understands that.
Yeah, it would be like the client security fund.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the court would enter an order, and then each year there's a sort of an annual renewal of the order establishing what the amount of the assessment is.
Right. And we would be foolish to not anticipate that there would be a lot of people that'd be very unhappy with this. So, in addition to the legislature, I mean, it just would be, because
It's like they're going to be unhappy when we get
that's right.
news
Yeah.
bill passed.
Oh, that's right. But just like with the client security fund, they're going to say, why am I paying this for somebody else's problem? I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but they are. And when we do this and the dues bill, they're really going to.
Well, and that's why I think we need to wait till after the election and sort of see
Sure.
what the court looks like. The Chief Justice, as we know, is very, very strong on lawyer mental health.
Absolutely.
And absolutely supportive of our lawyers assistance program, thinks the world of it. So I think in that regard, we've got a, we're already got a foot in the door. But one of the things, once we sort of think this through, that's why we suggested that third scenario is to kind of offset the pain of saying, okay, there's a new assessment. We could drop the dues down, and then we can have some ability to each year kind of look at what we need. And maybe that will, make the pill go down a little easier. And I think there's a real possibility that if this were sort of successful, we might be able to just sit back on the dues bill and I think we need to continue our efforts in that regard, because we just need to have that taken care of. We can't wait. And then 10 years from now, we need to have a higher ceiling, and that we're once again have a General Assembly that doesn't want to help us at all. So
No, but this could buy us some time with you get past virus stuff. I mean, I don't think they're going to be very apt to look at this during this COVID problem. And I think we can down the heat we're turning up on the bills due, or I keep saying it backwards, but until we can get something in place.
Yeah. Alice, if you added up our dues of $300 plus our client security fund, and if you had this LAP assessment, would we be still kind of in line nationally for comparable bars?
Yeah, Barbara, I haven't looked at those numbers in a long time, but we were sort of in the middle of the pack with regard to dues. This would make it, assuming we keep the dues at $300 and the client security fund is $25 like it is, we'd be at $355. And I think that is still right in the middle of the dues nationally, but that's a good thing to know. And we'll come back with a chart for you on that whenever the Finance and Audit Committee meets again.
We were about at the very median with what we've got right now. We were right at the 50% mark for being a medium when the numbers, the charts that Peter put together.
There you go. Peter's on the ball. Good job, Peter. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course I really think Alice's assessment of this is right. That this is probably something that we ought to be very circumspect about until after the election, and then try to look at what we think the right way to go forward with this, and to ensure that we have a solid LAP program after the dust settles and we see what the governance of the two branches of government look like.
Yeah. But this is interesting, and to me it's great, as Darren said, that we have this as a kind of an option that we can look at out there, because really we were feeling very hamstrung. But yeah, that's great. Okay. Any other discussion on this? There's certainly, I don't think, any action to be taken at this time, but really good information.
We'll continue to sort of evolve this, and maybe, I don't know, Barbara, maybe at some point, sort of a committee would be formed to kind of think through these political questions and how to go forward in the most astute way. It might be helpful for us to go back and look at how the Client Security Fund assessment was presented to the court at that time. I'll be glad to do some research on that so we have a better sense of how they proceeded then.
Sounds like a good thing for the Issues Committee next year, Marcy.
So, but you're right. We do know that the current chief has specifically stated how important she thinks LAP is. She said it over and over again, or the issues of client wellness, lawyer wellness. So great, good. Okay, then we had a couple of sort of add-on items to our agenda, and one of them is just, I heard him talking this, my days are running together, maybe it was yesterday, in the communication meeting about now that we are doing so many, we're communicating in different ways and not just person to person. So if we're going to be doing podcasts, if we're going to continue to be broadcasting our meetings, could we improve our equipment? Or we could, I think the alternate proposal was we could get Peter and Brian the biggest and best, newest iPhones if they're going to have to be continuing to use those to film.
I think Darren thinks this is a racket that Brian and I are doing, just trying to get new phones.
I think it is. There's no thinking to
it. And I don't think there's anything for this committee to vote on right now about this, but when we designed the building, the technology that was in place, high-end technology at the time in 2000, in that time frame, was still kind of the old idea of hardwired built-in technology. And unfortunately, we're almost right when the building opened is when the world changed and everything has become wireless and mobile. And so we certainly weren't anticipating the need to be live streaming all of our meetings and live streaming hearings and doing all of these podcasts and other things when we built and designed the building. And so it's time for a tech refresh, as it is in terms of the building. The technology in the building is hitting its end of life cycle as it is, and it's already hard enough to replace and repair what we have. But in doing a replacement, we think it's best to take a look at the needs of our building in order to improve our ability to broadcast meetings, live stream meetings from multiple rooms in our building, broadcast hearings as necessary, and do some of these things that the communications committee is interested in. So we want to get a consultant to look at that with us and give us some ideas and come back with something either split up to be partly in the state bar budget and partly with the foundation budget for this coming year to help fund some upgrades and new technology. We think is a good time to make those changes since nobody's really in the building. It might take some labor and some work, and it would be less disruptive if we do it while we're still working remotely.
Does there have to be any action taken for you to go ahead and hire a consultant?
No, I think we can go ahead and do that, Barbara, and get that information. And it's an unbudgeted item, but as we know, we're under budget this year for our expenses anyway. I also would like to get that information because the foundation board is meeting in November. Peter and I actually had told them last year, we think we're going to need some money for the technology and to improve our technology. But we didn't have any numbers to give to them at that time. I'd like to be able to go ahead and give them some forecasts of what we're asking from them. As you all know, the foundation has roughly $1.5 million. I'm looking at Jaya to confirm that. They have a pledge that they're going to use those funds for something related to the building because the funds were originally raised to support the construction of the building. And so they feel that that is their commitment to the donors of those funds. They are currently giving us $50,000 a year to offset the expenses for the building, but there is money there, and this is a building related need. And so I think we can get their financial support for this, and depending on how much we're talking about overall, there's a possibility that they might be willing to contribute the entire amount.
Sure. Good. Good. All right. So you don't need any action from this committee?
I don't think so. Peter, did you foresee us needing any action? It's very helpful for us to go to the foundation board and say the communications committee, and I think they actually did have a motion yesterday, or at least there was some kind of affirmation of the need for this, and for us to be able to share that with the foundation board, I think is helpful in making that pitch.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just point out that regardless of the need to upgrade our technology, we are nearing at some point within this next year or two the need to replace a lot of the technology as it is for just end of life cycle issues. I mean, we're having, and Joe could talk to this, we're already having a hard time finding replacement parts for a lot of things when they break down. So this is inevitable, but we want to take a proactive look and do it right.
Alice, foundation has 1.4 million approximately.
Thanks, Jaya.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have any questions on this? Comments? Okay, then we had another item of new business, and that's to talk about January meeting, and not this January, but January of 2022. And you'll recall that at one of our last meetings, we had talked about that perhaps going forward, we would have one meeting a year be by Zoom. And I know this is a terrible time to talk about it because we're all sick to death of Zoom and can't wait to get back in person. But, you'll recall the reasons we had talked about it was to each year going forward, that would save us some money. It would be convenient for some of our folks that have to travel a long way. January seemed to be the ideal time to do it because, in our fairly recent history, we all remember the panic we had to drive out of Raleigh as the snow and ice were falling. So for a lot of reasons, we talked about doing that. And one of the things that had been raised was that we have a long-term contract on our hotel rooms. So Alice has some information for us both about the cost of canceling the rooms, the timing of doing that, and we would just need to discuss the pros and cons.
I sent you this chart that I worked up to just show you sort of the timing issue that we have with cancellation. In 2019, Sharon did a great job of negotiating with the Crabtree Marriott. And I signed a series of contracts. We do contracts for each individual meeting, but we went ahead and locked in through 2025 simply because we could get the best price on rooms and on the years when we are responsible for a banquet, on the banquet costs and all of that. So we went ahead and did that. The way the cancellation schedule works, And it's regardless of whether it was the meeting in 2021 or the meeting in 2025, is from the date of the agreement, which is August of 2019, up to a year prior to the particular event, we already have a 10% cancellation penalty. It's 10% of estimated charges. I had Sharon go through and determine the estimated charges. If you look, if we time it correctly and were to cancel the January 2022 meeting, the 10% there would be $4,100 and et cetera. It goes down the list. It's not a huge amount of money, but it is money that we're paying simply for canceling a contract. Of course, we'd spend far more if we went ahead and had an in-person meeting. I had her do it with 2022 simply because that was the one that was most feasible. 2021, we're going to let things evolve a little bit more here, but I suspect I'm going to be asking the officers to make a decision about whether the January 21 meeting can be in person, if it's possible to do that. I doubt that it will be. I think we have all the same issues that we had for the October meeting. And it would be my intent at that juncture with your authority to go to the Crabtree Marriott and say, you know, frustration of purpose, impossibility, we want out of this contract. I don't want them to have any sense that we're thinking about canceling these other contracts at that point in time, because we want to maintain their goodwill. So not 2021. Then you look at 2022, and I have to tell you, I've thought a lot about this. And, you know, if we get live meetings again, if we have in-person meetings again, it's probably not at the soonest it would be is April. I'm doubtful that it will be April. So my suggestion is, because we have a number of counselors now, counselors that were new this year, we'll have new counselors in 2021, that maybe we make sure we go a full year with in-person meetings before we make a decision to change from having one meeting be virtual. I just feel like to make that change now, while we're still all in the midst of this, where we have some counselors who have experienced, you know, a normal year and others who have never experienced that, would just be hard to do. So if we are to cancel 2022, we have to give the Marriott notice in January of 2021, which, as I said, will be at the same time I will have asked them to release us from the contract. I just feel like that's kind of bad form across the board in terms of the relationship with the Crabtree Marriott, and also on this other note of where we've got, having not had in-person meetings for such a long period of time, it feels like the right thing to do is to have them for at least a year. But then starting in January 2023, that might be the appropriate time. We know we can do these virtual meetings. I wrote down the pros and the cons, other than not being together and the camaraderie, which is clearly a con. The other things that we missed by not having an in-person January meeting is an orientation for new counselors that's in person. And that is the one meeting where we have the ongoing relationship with the Bar Association, where every other year we host a joint dinner, and we have the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism's awards and all of that stuff. So that would have to change if we decided to do this with the January meeting. The big pro is that January is always the most difficult meeting if weather turns out to have any effect on it, and can cause quite a lot of havoc, actually. And that, and other than the joint dinner with the Bar Association, usually the January meeting is a pretty standard kind of meeting. So I guess my recommendation to you is that we not cancel the January 2022 meeting. That decision can be reconsidered when we get together again in preparing for the budget in December. We typically have an officers meeting to talk about the budget, and we can examine that. There's still some time to do it. I will mark my calendar for the drop dead date when we have to notify them in order to only pay the 10% penalty. Of course, we could wait a while and then have a 25% penalty too. So it's not completely off the table to do that. And then really just to let you all think about this and let your thinking evolve, and maybe even talk to other counselors to see how they feel about it. See if my sense that, you know, folks may want to go a whole year of having in-person meetings again to feel like we're getting back to normal. I might be totally wrong about that. And people may be saying, in fact, you know, it worked out pretty well that I could, you know, continue to do my regular work and attend state bar meetings by Zoom. It was actually more convenient and less overall expense to them individually. So I think getting some feedback on this is a good idea before any decision is made. But you needed to see how this would work if we made this decision. So that's the point of the chart.
Right.
Are you suggesting we do a survey, maybe?
I wouldn't do it now, I don't think. Like she said, everybody's so kind of tired of it right now.
Well, I didn't mean now. I just said,
Yeah.
is that what you're suggesting at some point in time?
I think maybe at some point that would be a good idea, Darren. I don't want to do it before I have the conversation with the Crabtree Marriott about the January 2021 meeting.
I wouldn't be surprised if the Bar Association wasn't having these same discussions, and if they decide to cancel a meeting, it may very well be their January meeting. So we may be, because I'd feel funny about pulling out, especially 22 when it's our year to host, to say, yeah, no, we're canceling. But that just may be a change because they're probably having budget issues too.
And I'll have that conversation with Jason,
Yeah.
Barbara,
Yeah.
to just kind of see where they are on it. And so we have a better sense on that as well. Yeah, at this point, this is a somewhat like the assessment. This is for your information, for you all to be thinking and letting us know if you have any questions, if there's any information we can gather, but that both sort of require some additional thought and discussion.
Alice, do you have the estimate on what the savings is from going to Zoom?
Yeah, typically a meeting, and Jaya, I'll let you correct me on this, but doesn't the cost of a typical meeting, not the summer meeting, which is always more expensive, and actually the October meeting is typically expensive because of the luncheon and the banquet, but I think it hovers in the 100,000 category. Is that fair, Jaya?
I'm sorry, for which meeting?
The average cost of a council meeting, an in-person council meeting.
So it varies meeting to meeting. The January and April meetings are around 55,000. That includes the hotel, meals, mileage, per diem, all those expenses. And the July meeting is the most expensive, about 120,000. And October meeting is usually around 90,000.
Thank you. Any other questions or discussion? Again, that's just something for us all to kind of think about. Any other items of business to come before this committee? All right, I think it's on to